Hello everyone, today we talk about Frederick the Great's strategic principles. In outline, I'm actually preparing a series about the 7 Years' War with the specific bias for the Hohenzollerns military practice rather than theory. It's not, as you know, the first time that we discuss Prussian warfare. It's not been such a frequent topic, but last year's spring I made a series especially about Prussian infantry, right? The general principle behind Prussian quality, in that sense, its original predilection for cold steel, and in fact Frederick was such a great proponent to, up to the point at which towards the later 18th century artillery began to gain the upper hand in the general army's balancement, and especially for the assaults that the Prussian army was famous for, and that today we'll partly observe at a strategic level, had to sort of slow down and in fact keep developing further instead that more missile approach to a degree. 18th century warfare is that fascinating because besides the almost perfect equation of linear warfare that the Enlightenment periods would like to sort of rationally abstract almost from the, in fact, otherwise quite crude reality of warfare, the latter was really dark and gritty, but especially very dynamic, very changing. We observed in part Frederick's principles, the ones of his generals, also how they performed in different warfare from the von Kriege series, that mostly, like for the, in fact, especially the second half of the 18th century, rightfully analyzed the same von Clausewitz's, native land and army in that sense, as Frederick before Napoleon was really like the top of that ancien regime type of warfare that was, however, unhinged. Remember that when Napoleon reached Potsdam, said to his marshals, look, if he had been still alive, we wouldn't be here today. Was naturally a generous appreciation for this giant of military history in the art of war, that, however, as in that same post-Jena-Auerstadt situation, the Prussians, including von Clausewitz, found out the hard way, of course, had been brutally surpassed by mass warfare, in that case also by the genius of Napoleon for that new scale of warfare in general. So today I had slightly less time than the usual, so I thought to make a brief recap that can be useful as a sketch or some notes, right? Even as in fact, as an introduction to the content we're gonna make next on the Silesian Wars, for example, and or like just what we already did on the Prussian army. This is valid in general also for 18th century warfare as a whole, because we will not just look at Frederick's ideas of strategy, naturally very much declined on the basis of Prussia, of her political and strategic objectives, because otherwise it's sort of, you have really to wait for von Clausewitz to have a general explanation what war essentially is in the history of civilization, but also in fact the limits of the 7 Years' War era armies that in fact were still limited in capacity, right, in order to at least step up and making, especially in this case, Prussia achieve a crushing victory of an enemy. It's like what the Germans would be able to do alone, like only in the 19th century, with the same unification of the country and the Clausewitzian theory actually applied to a very high doctrinal degree. So actually this video is probably the first one of a series I will make on German military theory, starting from more or less this time, but you will see how it develops. this is also important for other videos that we made really in abundance about especially 17th century but also 16th century warfare. And so making you reflect how a relatively quick depassage from what it seemed like still, say, Montecuccoli's times, a staticization of warfare that was sort of difficult to even surpass, had come, but how at the same time, and we don't usually think of the 18th century in these terms of its art of war, because we sort of idealize it, but together, as we were saying before, with the Enlightenment as a period on its own that almost owes no further developmental connection, especially prior times. Still a pretty limited type of warfare, one only now emancipating itself from the narrow confines of what the same army's maneuverability, for example, had obliged, like the general art of war proceedings. This is definitely an underappreciated aspect, right? And we will start, of course, from the mid 18th century, where in fact things were still, in fact, more similar to the end, to the beginning of the century than they would be to the end of it, for sure. In 1748, Frederick II articulated in his Principes Généraux that, quote, "Our wars must be brief and intense. Engaging in a prolonged campaign is entirely against our interests. Extended warfare leads to the gradual erosion of our admirable discipline, depopulates our nation, and depletes our resources." Right. This is pretty clear, beautiful, like, smart, a synthetic statement by, in fact, that great mind, which, as you know, as you can appreciate here in French, like Principes Généraux, owed much, in fact, to the intellectual vibrancy of his times, except he was actually a much more conservative and traditional mind than others, including many admirers of his at the time would like to paint him like we think often about the say the age of absolutism that was not actually absolutistic at all. If anything, the problem of these rulers was to achieve some degree of full or at least virtually complete homogeneity in terms of rulers' practice. Warfare, in many ways, was still seen as the sport of the great rulers, of the great monarchs of Europe. Still, the pre-revolutionary Europe, regardless of the sort of evolving feelings regarding, in fact, also the let's say the capacity of the so-called ancien regime to hold the bridles of their people, of their subjects, were characterized by the latter's fidelity and almost, in fact, individual, like special relation with the ruler, right? And so it's a very different picture from one we mostly get from the time, as we are habituated to emphasize instead the rationalism, the sort of. By the way, the 18th century, also in philosophy, owes practically everything to the 70s. Like, if everything you want to find in principle, you can argue that it's always the degeneration of traditional principles that were stated before, but in many ways was just a rumination of what had already been expressed in the last generations, plus an increased need for categorism and so on. Frederick II was also a practical ruler, one endowed indeed with a particular martial prowess. And here, when he says our wars, of course, as I was saying before, refers to the Prussian conduct of war that was essentially dictated by the circumstances, right? Prussia is, of course, celebrated in this era because of the quality of its armies, but as the same miracles, the repeated miracles of the House of Brandenburg, accompanied by, so in fact, many effective defeats of Prussia, at least in terms of ratio of strength, right, and in fact, military capacity at that point, was a pretty let's say, troubled country in the general international arena. Or you can say it was a fragile country because the Prussian military achievements definitely proved otherwise. But let's say this was still a time in which Prussia could be, if not erased from the map, this would happen actually with Poland, at the end of the century, in a literal sense, but could definitely be broken as the major power that it would especially evolve into in the 19th century. Right? When you look at Prussia, but also Austria, realize that what France had achieved essentially already by the second half of the 17th century, this countries, this monarchies achieved in the first half of the 18th, right? And also with often more limitations, were typically Central European in nature, and that had brought, in fact, these powers emerging as German powers, however, emerging mostly outside of the properly German lands, with controlling other peoples such as the Poles and the Hungarians, etc. We should also, in fact, talk a bit more about the veritable nature of these armies' identities. Many troops were mercenaries. They came from faraway places. You had so many other Germans in the Prussian armies. You had Poles, you had French, you had Italians. You have really also a very brutal way just of putting these armies together, except we, of course, can start highlighting that proto-mass warfare dimension mostly connected to the national core that gets ever more sort of efficient, uniformed, and in this sense ideologically compacted by these wars that could be wars, in fact, of annihilation. And Prussia did risk that on multiple occasions, much more than other countries did at the same time, regardless, in fact, of the general political balance. Was potentially to destroy any at this point. So Prussia had limited resources overall. As the Saint Frederick said, certain parts of the country, like Pomerania, were, Prussia actually itself, were less appealing than even Siberia, right? This gave at least the advantage of cultivating an incredibly tough and primitive breed of people that were excellent at the type of bloodbath and sort of very physical engagement that especially the early Prussian doctrine under Frederick II proposed in terms of hand-to-hand combat, of also steel-like discipline that brought, in fact, I think 70% of the Prussian officers during the 7 Years' War to be annihilated in these fights, which also brought some partial advantages, some relative advantage as far as the compaction of the monarchy, the sort of nobiliary level was concerned. But that, in fact, was the product of a terrifying attritional type of warfare, considering the frequency of these clashes. Frederick, and this is also often overlooked, went through a veritable hell in the first part of his realm, but he was also a very a long-lasting ruler that in the last decades of his reign really governed in peace because of the balance that had been achieved also through this sacrifice, right? Speaking of the utility of warfare. Needless to say, that attritional dynamic was not what Frederick was searching, given the limits in his resources, if anything, literally from a demographic point of view, because people died a lot. And that's why he says that our wars must be brief and intense, right? Engaging in prolonged campaigns entirely against our interests. Extended warfare leads to the gradual erosion of our admirable discipline, which also is a very important strategic concept, given that, yes, you can be disciplined as you like, but if you just protract the campaigns indefinitely, or if you fight in some sort of indecisive, toll situation, you are essentially breaking that very spirit that does not come like as a standard pack just from a levy of brutal East Germans. It has to do with the very specific quality of an army regulated for a given time, for a given purpose, and no more, right? Because it costs, right? It's not just costing life, it costs labor, it costs really a lot in the strains that the country can take. Frederick rightfully says, in fact, this attritional warfare would depopulate our nation and deplete our resources. So when you look at the King of Prussia's modus operandi, you realize that he implemented these principles by seizing the initiative at the onset of the war and throughout subsequent campaigns. Right? This is almost a meme. Like every time war breaks out, Prussia enters Dresden, Saxony out, because without that you can't basically continue also the war with the resources. It's a bit like, say, here there is not much of a national connection in a military historical sense, but it's just like what Germany did with, say, in order to attack the Soviet Union, you need, say, the French and the Italian war industry, because otherwise Germany alone cannot do it, and they have to essentially secure the control of the rest of Europe. Here it's something similar, right? I can't stress again, regardless of the glorious Prussian path, right, in the generations between a defeat and another, indeed, still, in fact, this country was that vulnerable at that point. And what Frederick did is not just measured in, okay, this or that battle, but of course how you had brought that battle to assist in an ancillary function, as von Clausewitz himself says, strategy. And ultimately how that strategy is, of course, declined to a political purpose, that is the one there of essentially hitting the enemy as quickly, as early as to stun him, to surprise him, and preventing him from gaining the upper hand by drawing Prussia into a protracted campaign that may even be successful for Prussia, but that may consume too much of its resources for her to essentially be able for a next war. And so when you realize, we'll see now, of course, that at times the country was fighting against Russia and Sweden and France and Austria, more or less simultaneously, things were much more complicated for the Prussian than they seemed. And so that we talk about the miracles of the House of Brandenburg, because at some point it was just some general luck and political intention that saved Prussia, such as, the madness of the Tsar Peter III, that cried every time the Prussians lost and wanted his Russian troops to be uniformed as Prussians, with great disappointment and hatred of his own generals. But because, yes, Prussia had been defeated, was losing the war, and so was saved by these veritable miracles, right? Because otherwise the enemies would have marched on Berlin. So Frederick, for example, gains a significant economic and military advantage by invading Silesia in 1740, or Saxony in 1756, as we were pointing out before. During the 7 Years' War, there were only a few occasions when Frederick's enemies managed to take the initiative and occupy substantial areas of Prussian territory in turn. This is also important. In war, you don't have stupid people at large. Yes, there can be bad decisions and inexplicable ones, but they're mostly just dictated by the general beginnings. So that's why actually Prussia could enjoy some advantages at one point, as it was put like an army with a state rather than a state with an army. And so there were so many preoccupations connected with that rightful paranoia of being invaded and conquered by others. But others tried that as well, right? However, aside from East Prussia, that was also, let's say, not simply expandable, but was, of course, much less developed, as we were saying before, than, say, than Brandenburg. These occupations were merely temporary and short-lived. They were also calculated to an extent. I mean, you can even, in dire situations, give up a part of your territory, and especially if you're, and hopefully, I would say, your army is still intact, and you can supply it from the more productive, in that case, protected parts of your possessions. You can hope, in fact, to destroy the enemy army and recover everything, even with the interests on top. Now, Frederick was often the first to attack in the spring, which in Central Europe is definitely not particularly warm. This quick response proved particularly effective in April 1757, when it was the Prussian well-stocked supply depots enabling Frederick to invade Bohemia by maneuvering detached columns before the traditional start of the spring operations themselves, right? So what did Frederick do? He didn't even need to coordinate with allies, also because basically he was isolated. He was mostly surrounded by his much more powerful enemies. So that was usually not an option. So he would, at that point, gain, if anything, one advantage out of it: the fact that he controlled all of his of the available armored forces under his command, which, as we will see later, was partly also limited in the complexity of certain operations, but due to the intrinsic nature of the armies of the time, rather than any Prussian particular condition, that on the contrary displayed great maneuverability, given like the possibilities of the time, allowing him to choose the timing and methods of his military strategies at will. Right? He basically attacked in 1757 before the enemy armies could simply coalesce and come out of their quarters to be on the field when this was the conventional time of the year. Naturally, this was, as we just said, allowed by the fact that the Prussians had worked hard to restock their supply depots in order to sustain, in fact, say a more costly campaign, because it was happening before the normal period when, say, foraging the forces was easier due to the warmer weather and the agricultural allowances. Let's put it in this way. And so there, you see, it's not much like the enemy was not good at war in a strictly military sense, but of course there were many reasons. Like, not every country can make that has even the pressure to make such an effort to get more resources in surplus compared to what, say, what the world needs. Let's put it in this way. So it was the metus of Stilus, to say it the Latin way, to allow in certain circumstances Prussia to have thought, to have worried the most, and therefore to have found solutions beforehand. These are the factors that balance the odds when you wonder about the strategic political balances, broader international strength ratios, etc. By the way, there were, in fact, cultural limits within the same Prussian establishment. I mean, the Junker were not this explosion of innovation, as you know. In fact, not all Prussian officers shared Frederick's proactive vision. First of all, it cost a lot, right? And given that the country was essentially a feudal one run by these people, and they were the main problem, like in trying to make things work, and just external pressure would, in fact, make them abide. During the winter of 1756-1757, so before the spring where that surplus by which that surplus had been satisfactorily stockpiled, many were content to hold the positions gained in the previous year's offensives and say, okay, let's not go further beyond this because, let's just defend, right? But that would have actually been detrimental because it would have given the initiative to the enemy that would have eventually just given that they would have been able to mobilize more resources in the interest of time throughout the campaign from their bigger countries and with the help of allies and so on. So more disorderly, but still more quantitatively. That would have actually worn out Prussia, that maybe in the minds of certain officers was just also too overconfident regarding the sheer, quality of the army, without understanding, of course, that the quality of an army may be deteriorated, may become at that point the very Schwerpunkt of the situation. And for you to actually deteriorate for a type of war you're not designed to wage, and in fact it would have been a waste for Prussia to remain of the defensive with that type of army that was better than anybody else's as at offensive instead in that particular international situation, right? But also with, again, the limits of, let's say, even a smaller force, right? And one that stemmed also from a greater effort of the population in comparison to other countries. And on that occasion, in fact, 1756-57, Frederick expressed his frustration at his officers, stating, "My officers only want to act defensively. Damn them. But I will soon change all of this." Frederick had had a very tough school back in the day. He had seen his best friend killed by his father, sentenced to death because of their juvenile misbehavior, and he had been forced with Prussian rigidity, to say the least. Except he was also very, as we said before, intelligent, curious, even artistically talented individual. At least he developed that to cope, apparently, with that kind of brutality and rigidity. After major defeats of the Prussian army, he was described as almost going insane. He fell into depression. Apparently the only way to calm him, even after these massive disasters and baths of blood, was playing the flute, notoriously. He also was a good composer himself. Now, from that point onward, 1756-57, Frederick entrusted his troops with nearly continuous operations throughout the winter. Here we are already, as you understand, in the 7 Years' War, and directed additional forces in areas, primarily in Saxony. Again, that was the the first one to know when the Prussians had woken up, in bad mood, where Frederick's generals had not secured any troops. These winter campaigns, undertaken amidst heavy snowfall, severely disrupted the Austrian, imperial, in fact, Reichsarmee, and the Saxons stationed along the Saale River. This is particularly important because we've seen from Clausewitz that, the norm still this time in history was to stop operations in winter. And still, in spite of this extra work that, again, Prussia was mandatorily performing, the battles of Prague on May the 6th, 1757, and Kolin in following June the 18th, notoriously brought Frederick's plan for a swift resolution to the war to an abrupt end. These were heavy defeats of the Prussians. Now, confronted with the challenge of managing this multi-front conflict over the years, and so not something that you could simply, address, with adequate forces just accumulated over a long amount of time, prosper times of peace, but repeatedly, in a situation in Europe and in the world at that point, it was rapidly, in fact, intensifying that conflictual direction. Frederick's response was notably aggressive. The best way, again, was to beat his adversaries in interest of time. There is a beautiful explanation that he gave to the Duke of Angers in 1757 about it, saying, quote, "I must wage a defensive war, yet I face such a multitude of enemies that I am compelled to take the offensive. I find myself in a precarious position. The Russians are to my left, down to my right, and the Swedes are behind me." It's beautiful, by the way, how he sees himself projected towards the south. How, I ask, can I possibly fight a purely defensive battle? Right? On the contrary, my survival has depended on striking at every opportunity and achieving small successes whenever possible. Right? Here, of course, he's entailing the fact that he had to beat his enemies in detail before they could unite and therefore just overwhelm even the very highly qualitative Prussian force, and even with the advantage of defense. Again, we talked a lot about the laws of reciprocity, of the characteristics of offensive, of defensive. Von Clausewitz is very clear about this. And so I always remember that of the offensive is actually the weak form of war, but with the positive objective, whereas defensive is the strong form of war, but with negative objective. And the latter especially entails, at least in a strictly military sense, an ultimate counteroffensive, right? When fighting an engagement, you defend just because you know that at some point you can't gain something in terms of enemy exhaustion that allows you to essentially level the odds and strike back because you have an advantage, right? And so here, of course, it's political as well because it depends on things that were not decided on the battlefields, but at the diplomatic tables. But once, in fact, war had to be waged, like it was important to avoid, from the Russian standpoint, of course, the enemies that surrounded it to concentrate on her, right? The Prussian army, of course, possessed a remarkable capacity for maneuver and tactical superiority. This is the entire point of Frederick the Great and the great, in fact, Prussian military culture of the era. We discussed it, but we'll come back on it better. Of course, this is in many ways the true strategic principle. Von Clausewitz said something along the pattern of, the first, say, thing in strategy is to be very strong, right? If you want to win, that's actually a thing. It may sound something very, very banal, but it's actually not. I mean, superiority is not gained by sitting there and hoping that things will magically solve themselves, because the enemy is working, and if you don't, you're just letting him gain more, right? You can, of course, gain more yourself in the meanwhile. You can hope to beat him at that race. But the Prussian army was that hell of a system because it was designed to beat the enemy in maneuvering, any actual engagement, right? There is all the idea, of course, of the so-called oblique order that many people says, oh, it's just like at the time of Epaminondas. It's not quite the same thing. Like we also looked at it at the Battle of Leuctra, that we never saw actually a Prussian battle, like where in fact Frederick employed the so-called oblique order to essentially attack the enemy partially from the flank, from an angle that would put in crisis its linear formation. In fact, beat it in detail, like part by part of the line, rather than from the side, rather meeting it frontally. You can do this only if you're already very intensely trained, if you are motivated also to risk that much. And so it's a combination of incredible factors from leadership. Just Frederick could pull that off, frankly, in that circumstance, but also with that specific military instrument, right? So the concept of oblique order, from a tactical point of view, is, at least in a military sense, similar in concept to what Frederick achieved by skillfully leveraging, in fact, its army by regrouping his best units and focusing on one opponent at a time. It's as if you beat, say, first Austria, then Russia, etc., you can actually see it as, defeating a piece of the enemy line in open field in the same way. And of course, like, many of these battles were actually massive bloodbaths, right? With the Russians, it was always like a very closely fought clash. Like, it's these were, and again, you can't always catch the enemy by surprise to the point that you're going to have this decisive advantage. Linear warfare here is the general convention, just because there aren't literally any other ways to simply get around the enemy, right? That, how do you do that with such massive armies? At best, you can try to surprise them by with speed, with that good order that goes with it, and in some certain liminal cases making it. And that's where you can understand how, in a sense, desperate this Prussian motivation really was in order to gamble that, because it was incredibly risky, right? If it went wrong, they would be annihilated in turn. Whereas the conventional idea of linear tactics, meeting face to face, also allowed for some, greater capacity for retreat, for not being surprised, knowing exactly what you were facing once at a time. Here we see how, instead, truly asymmetrical warfare always is, even when there is a general convention, right? There isn't such a thing like, in fact, conventional warfare, strictly speaking, or even symmetric warfare. It doesn't mean anything. You can't win a war if everything was symmetric, right? It would be just a draw. It's never like the case, but you must produce the conditions for placing your enemy in a condition of inferiority that is going to pay for. And so this can happen also by accident sometimes, but it requires also some systemic capacity, especially when you are actually, in a broader sense, the weaker power. And this is exactly the history of Prussia during this time. Normally, also, it's a bit of a meme. Frederick would focus on Austria first, because that was, of course, like the closer enemy, the one that would, through the same Silesia, attack sort of the more meaningful provinces that, also rising up the Oder River, could reach Berlin, and so the Prussian heartland. For Russia, it was more of a problem. Like, they had to cross much more lands with sort of tougher communications, and still from the east, so not threatening actually the single most important lands of the Hohenzollern. For France, also, it was sort of difficult just to operate into the German, up to the German heartland, especially when one Allied army was taken out by the Prussians already. This is the same problem that armies had in operating like in this vast theater that now, admittedly, as gradually was opening to the possibilities of the art of war that we've seen, for example, during the same Battle of Austerlitz, when armies were much speedier, but of course, especially the French one, because it was more updated to that scale of war in the Allies in Central Europe. There's the anecdote that they didn't have, they used different calendars. Say the Russians using still the Julian one as opposed to the Gregorian. That's a myth, actually, but still, coordinating movements, maneuvers, across thousands of kilometers. It's actually extremely complicated. You can't simply predict where to meet, what will and when, what will have the enemy done in the meanwhile. That's always the same problem. Everything modifies itself along the way, right? And that's, in fact, going back to the 7 Years' War, what Frederick was exploiting in order to succeed. This approach was intended to gain the necessary time and space to address the next threat. So again, beating the enemies once at a time. So one of the miracles of the House of Brandenburg occurred. Well, I don't know. The French simply decided that, with other allies out of the way, was so unrealistic to march on Berlin, and even though they could have attempted it, and of course it would have been a much riskier outcome for the Prussians than for the French. So you understand there that there is sometimes like even a lack of political motivation rather than any military issue. And that's actually very even if you look at any war, including the ones that are being fought right now. There is so much that gets in between, like the actual intentions, the actual possibilities, and it's not like wars take a course that you can't quite simply have an influence on, but definitely there is a general exhaustion, there are moral forces, there is something in the system that simply gets that breaks down over time, and that you must make an increasingly larger effort to keep standing. That's why, again, Frederick before was emphasizing the fact that had these wars lasted longer, it hadn't he taken immediate measures to try to beat the enemies in detail at the beginning, which still entailed somehow importantly long campaigns, the Prussian army would have deteriorated, would have decayed, and so all that great discipline that was in corner saving not just the Prussian army on the battlefield, but Prussia on the map of Europe, was to be miraculously calibrated. In addition to the, as we've seen, political, in the shortcomings of fact of that same strategy that at some point failed, right? That eventually saved the House of Brandenburg. Although contemporaries viewed Frederick's strategy as an efficient use of resources through the use of interior lines, Frederick II himself found little enthusiasm for it. This is also incredibly important. We have looked at interior lines in the Von Kriege series. We'll come back on them. Of course, you do have an advantage if you have a, generally speaking, defensive purpose. And so in this case, you're sort of offending, but still within, say, a narrower geographical confine than, say, what your enemies will do. All right, they have to send their armies pretty far away, and so they're not operating much by internal lines, especially not for an offense, for a defensive purpose. The reason why Frederick the Great would not be enthusiastic for it is that, of course, this was just done from a condition of inferiority, the one we pointed out before. He was just trying to survive, with less means than his enemies, and so this situation could appear, because of the great Prussian victories, glorious, but of course was not ideal, was not a place where you wanted to be. Frederick recognized that prolonged warfare could wear down armies through fatigue and extensive marches, inevitably leading to unfavorable outcomes. And so the Prussian army was not, again, just always of the same quality. You were forced, even scoring all the victories that you needed one after the other, in a place where your army could be essentially defeated, as it would be, and because of the general lack of quality due to the deterioration during the campaign. The Prussians lacked the capability to sustain a constant offensive across all fronts. They couldn't simply say, okay, well, now we will we will invade Russia, we will take St. Petersburg, or we will march on Vienna or on Paris. This was obviously not the end game. It could have not been, right? It was about fencing off these giants to maintain Prussia and hopefully with enough resources to continue the struggle at times indefinitely, if you consider that, of course, the general future on the longer run was not predictable. At times, as seen in battles like Schmottseifen in 1759 and Bunzelwitz in 1761, it was essential to dig in and await the enemy's movements. There weren't the conditions for simply being perennially on the offensive, both tactically and strategically. So these were simply moments in which the Prussians had to accept that attritional increase at least, and leaving even the initiative to the enemy for a while, because that changes depending, again, on the circumstances. Again, you can check out the Funkriege series. We talk so much about defense and attack, and so there are, depending on the situation, there are pros and cons that you wanna profit or stay away from. Now, in other areas, Prussian force, and by the way, here, there were defeats as well, so it didn't work evenly, but it was still the best course of action, admittedly. Had they done something different, they would have lost more disastrously, right? In Kunnersdorf, right, now in other areas, Prussian forces or their detachments became targets of enemy maneuvers as well. Even at battles like Neuss, Breslau, Hochkirch, Meissen, and Linitz. So this shows how, of course, the enemy wasn't sitting ducks. They had their own maneuvering, and actually, as it's also notorious, we will see in the series, especially about the 7 Years' War. Warfare this time is largely about trying to outmaneuver the enemy, essentially to make its supply lines collapse, cutting him off from its operational bases and procure the general collapse of the army. So it's as if these armies were connected to home by a thread, and these armies were confronting each other, saying, "I want to cut your thread. No, you won't." Because remember this, that unlike in Napoleonic warfare, when armies began to be so big that literally supply trains disappeared, except for irreplaceable resources that had to be sent from mostly the motherland, like, I don't know, war horses or artillery, that, however, are relatively contained in spite of the qualitative cost, in fact. These armies here, albeit foraging as well, around, they were heavily dependent in their composition on these supply lines, right? They necessitated this constant train of resources coming from the motherland. And so you understand also what limitations like stretched armies, like the faraway theaters really had. Always bearing in mind that logistics is not decisive, right? Warfare is not, some people say it's about logistics. Logistics is not even a branch of properly of the art of war per se. It does count, but it's not a military factor per se, right? Strategy is more important than logistics, and it's also aimed, in fact, at demolishing logistics. And without mentioning, you can screw everything up with a perfectly supplied army as well. Now, after 1758, there were moments when Frederick's resolve faltered, right, because of the heavy blows that he took. And again, nothing is more cruelly false than the butcher's myth. The commander-in-chief has the wall, a fort, on his shoulders, right? And think about being on top of this, like a sovereign monarch that has been born and raised to the ultimate end of being successful, right? Of defending his nation with his life and having all the honor of his house, the prayer of his subjects on him, and being solely responsible for this all. Frederick was a warrior ruler, differently from, say, I don't know, most of his enemies. When you look at Louis XV or Catherine the Great or Maria Theresa, all enormous rulers in their own account, but Frederick was the guy who took the field, right? So that's quite different. Of course, he had to confront himself with generals in that vest were, of course, very challenging. But he was there, and he was there to almost like to die at some point, to risk being captured, etc. Right? And I don't remember how. I think it was after these victories that he encountered. I think it was a prisoner. They had lost. The Prussians had lost, and of course, you wouldn't know how the situation would evolve. Everything could collapse. Other countries could mobilize against you. That's the kind of burden. And apparently, he encountered. This was, I think, it was a native French, however, Prussian aristocrat that had defected to, I think, the Austrians or something like that. And he was recaptured even in the Prussian defeat by the Prussians. And he was thinking about, if I remember correctly, but the anecdote is that he was thinking to defect to the enemy. And Frederick said, I'm thinking about this too. Like the same king of Prussia, or in Prussia, as he was granted by the Holy Roman Imperial laws, would think in that circumstance as a soldier himself to defect to another count. It sounds a bit like another Frederick of Hohenstaufen of the second, that when in a very different situation the Mongol Khan asked him to submit, he said, okay, I will, but if you give me like a place as falconer at your court. When also the Pope responded to the same request, and basically the Pope said to the Mongol Khan to fuck himself. But these are the kind of spirits that we have to look up to when looking at history. And definitely Frederick the Great, Frederick II of Hohenzollern, is one of them. And so think of what it means for a man like him's resolve to falter. It's something that would completely destroy you physically as a human being. For the slobs that we are in the 21st century, in fact, one of the most distinctive aspects of Frederick's personality was his aggressive spirit, always managing to reassert itself. Right? You can't be, and you should be also hit that hard to understand what it feels, so that you're willing to go into that again, because you're going to come out of it. And exposure to, of course, controlled exposure to trauma, even though the trauma there is also real, right, as it can't be controlled. Hopefully you're trying to avoid that, right? That's what we always do. But is quintessential in testing, but also consolidating the backbone of such figures. Frederick espoused the belief that battles ultimately determine a nation's fate. And he was definitely right, especially in that time in history. In warfare, it is crucial to engage in decisive actions, not only to extricate oneself from challenging situations, but also to place the enemy at a similar disadvantage, thus avoiding a protracted conflict. And indeed, like if Frederick defeated a nation's army, yes, there were circumstantial factors that wouldn't allow him to press on that enemy so easily as they would do, with him in similar, in the opposite circumstances. But of course, that defeat was relevant. The odds were tendentially balanced, so at least the country was knocked out of the war, and Prussia could gain, as in Frederick words, like the tiny bit at a time that would eventually reinforce Prussia in the meanwhile, in spite of all the costs, etc. And that's also something that you measure really in great losses. It's difficult if you make comparisons also in your life, like how much, for example, you gave away to obtain a certain result, right? And how can you say exactly what it would have been, right, with or without something? Just time can tell most of the times, unless it's something properly big, recognized, etc. But especially at the moment, those losses are devastating. They are really that painful to suffer, and the end game is just hopefully like surviving, like yet at this game, this play. Now, the experience gained during the 7 Years' War taught Frederick the Great that once victory is achieved on the battlefield, it is essential to pursue the enemy relentlessly and take full advantage of the favorable circumstances. As such opportunities are rare, and especially that's the moment in which, as we were just saying, you can sort of make the enemy scramble in ways that are often rushed and chaotic, and so you can often get more than that. Seemingly, however, these could be a risk as well, like pursuing an enemy too much, especially in when you think about the East opening itself as a war frontier, realizing that there is another enemy from the other side arriving may limit these opportunities, because you don't have to exhaust your army before then it already is. In fact, after even a victory, you will see now what kind of intrinsic limits exist. It's obvious that when engaged in battle, Frederick's objective remains singular, nothing less than the complete destruction of the opposing army. That is very much like also what von Clausewitz agrees, in line of practice rather than of principle. In fact, the same principle virtually substantiating itself in. However, this is also important because this happens basically in any war. The true goals of Frederick II were never fully realized. As we were hinting at before, despite the tactical victories of the Prussian army during the 7 Years' War, this success never matched the accomplishments, for example, of Napoleon's Grande Armée at Jena-Auerstadt in 1806. The reason why I'm saying this is, of course, that you can't compare. In fact, even though we're talking a relatively few years of distance between Napoleon and Frederick the Great, these two great commanders, because the art of war had changed. In the same macroscopical way, the French had marched without the problems, say, of the 7 Years' War on Berlin. But this is exactly the point. We're talking about two different systems, and this allows us, of course, to at least define the limits of not just the Prussian, but European armies during the 7 Years' War. We will talk more about the 7 Years' War. Again, I don't make normally manual lessons on modern history, but of course we should give some general background to these military historical insight. We can, however, delineate these characteristics. So first of all, we were hinting at before, there were logistical limitations, right? The command and control system as well, used in the 18th century, restricted effective troop deployments on the battlefield to no more than 60,000 men. This is incredibly important because when we look at industrial warfare, which is essentially what this still is, because the Industrial Revolution was essentially in theory, but and that's in fact like the later wars, if anything, that showed the difference. If you look at ancient medieval history, you realize that the maximum really you could realistically control on the battlefield also was not above 50,000 men, right? Realistically, there would be so much to discuss about it, also regarding the different eras. But don't think that the modern era was actually a time in which armies were that bigger, saying that the medieval ones. This is a complete misunderstanding of the art of war. There is a lot of insistence from also YouTube channels to stress that ancient battles were so big and the medieval ones were so small. This is actually not true. Like the scale had remained practically the same. When you look at the size of even, like we were in the second half of the 18th century, like of course, the armies of the 7 Years' War were quite powerful. They had artillery, they had major supplying systems. We're talking about much more compact states that concentrated a lot of quality in these forces. There had been times in which, in fact, armies were even larger. Look at the War of Spanish Succession, that brought at a point like have hundreds of thousands of men on the field, and basically being unable to command them, right? Having more men than these at the time was already understood like essentially counterproductive, and so mid 18th century warfare had developed towards a more qualitative direction, with more intensive training of the troops, also like the investment in firearm technologies mostly. But we're looking at contained forces that can be easily attrition, especially considering that this number of 60,000 is limited by a single, let's say, a main logistical line, right? And that still European countries basically cannot simply operate like with armies that go back and forth from the ends of the continent. It's something that mostly develops in the 19th century, right? So any other say attempt before was extremely demanding, to say the least. And although armies occasionally fielded numbers beyond this threshold, indeed, also in this era, the Supreme Command could only realistically manage and control forces of roughly, again, that 60,000 men size. This is important because this is what you're going to fight with. So of course, you can have reserves, you can scattered across the theater, you can preside fortresses that are still important. In the art of war, we will see now how, for example, the Prussians were not particularly equipped for siege warfare compared to their foes, because they had invested much more in the quality of open field and confrontations, right? And the sense that warfare was, generally speaking, widening, and fortresses were becoming less relevant, and pitched battles were a bigger deal. Like, of course, was spot on. This is, of course, the philosophy, generally speaking, that the same 7 Years' War was fought on, but occasionally you would have also to stop and besiege, which is still, like always, a very demanding task. Another factor we can highlight is the lack of a permanent structure of divisions or corps, hindering the effective detachment of units for pursuit operations. As such, formations were only intended as temporary solutions. As you know, this is mostly a characteristic, in fact, that would evolve in the Napoleonic era. We talked about that specifically. We've seen it very well in the Von Kriege series as well. What does this mean? It means, first of all, that, as we've seen, there aren't particularly large forces to begin with. So also the concept of divisions or corps, also just even splitting an army or having multiple armies respectively on the field, it's something very fundamentally difficult to achieve. You can have a main effort with some force, and those 60,000 that you can hope to fight on the battlefield with entirely, and then other, I don't know, 20,000, but it's already a big effort, right? For a diversionary secondary theater. But the main problem, as we'll see now, emerges mostly when, after a battle, you don't really have some units that are conceived to be used, first of all, as reserves in general, to spare, like for an attritional type of warfare. These engagements are, as we've seen, mostly resolved by climatic battles that at that point decide the war with a single army, not multiple armies along the front that at some point are going to also all come together. So simply, if not a much smaller scale, of course, than Napoleonic wars. You don't have really an homogeneity, a uniformity of the troops to the point you can't simply split them in equally frameable commands and organics like the division can. They're not trained for that, right? Once they fight this battle, it's over. Like, you can also hope, as we were saying before, to pursue the enemy, but at large, the best way you can do that is with, so for numerical, for scale reasons, with the only army that you have fought with, and so with forces that are not even specifically agglutinated to have, I don't know, some, again, reserves intended just for pursuing the enemy, etc. It's all carried out at a smaller and sort of clumsier level, right? The same goes with corps. At large, you have also normally just one army, and with the others that are operating also maybe as reserves, but in some other parts, especially for Prussia, to check mostly a certain situation, trying to slow down an approaching enemy rather than facing him, really, and or cooperating with the other army, where the main effort is concentrated. During the 7 Years' War, you have advances in weaponry, particularly artillery. We saw it again in that video about the same Frederick realization of the fact that cold steel was not anymore the way to go, because that was good up to a certain point where firepower was not particularly enhanced, but after a while you could gap again. You could surpass the enemy, let's say, in quality, if these were not particularly trained and particularly aggressive, but at a point when combined arms are keeping to develop, you can't just do everything with a blade. And so also the lethality of engagements on the battlefield was increasing to the degree which you needed to concentrate forces paradoxically and to provide them with an equally large firepower. Otherwise, you couldn't probably even conventionally fight against the enemy. This is what is really happening at the time. Another limiting factor was constituted by the fact that by the end of a day's fighting, the units actively involved were often, if not decimated, exhausted, so leaving the surviving soldiers physically exhausted, unable to quickly resume operations, and all this because, again, there wasn't much of a further reserve or an army that could split in equally smaller ones, like in Napoleonic division. The strict discipline of the Prussian army would falter during extended pursuits, right? And as such, given that they weren't really just running after the enemy, but also engaging in different fights, etc., it's not like the Prussians were not capable of doing that, but they would have essentially been attrition. They would have lost soldiers who were so good when fighting in a conventional manner that it was a pity just to wear out like that. Literally, there are strictly demographic concerns that Prussia has. If you look at the numbers with its opponents, so you can't simply throw them away. Of course, Prussian discipline, we said at the beginning, envisage a very straightforward approach to strategy. So yes, you had to possibly, of course, place the enemy in a condition of asymmetry, of inferiority, that would go at its detriment. But otherwise, Prussian discipline was designed for the more conventional linear tactical purpose. So the idea of facing the enemy frontally and being better at them, not much just at cold steel, but also at firepower and order. And so the capacity to advance, to impact against the enemy in a more straightforwardly frontal way, which is, in fact, if you're superior, the thing you should always aim towards, and that real armies are supposed to always pursuing that as a general principle. As we were hinting at just now, the Prussian army of the 7 Years' War was not adequately prepared to conduct large-scale sieges. They had invested essentially all they had in the quality of their troops of the line for open field engagements. Artillery, etc., would have constituted like a secondary purpose, especially for sieges that were hopefully to be bypassed just by winning this dramatic confrontations in open field. This means, however, that since siege warfare was always there anyway, regardless of this obvious direction at larger, their decrease in importance, the Prussians consistently encountered significant challenges in, for example, consolidating their victories by capturing cities and fortifications. The conquests of Breslau and Schweidnitz at the end of the 1757 campaigns were notable exceptions to this pattern, because again, it's not like the Prussians were particularly bad at siege warfare, but they were not particularly invested in that and equipped for it. So yes, maybe at large they were of course worse than their opponents, but this was still part of a broader strategic pattern and specialization. Confronted with simultaneous threats from all directions, Frederick II often lacked the time or capability to defeat and fully pursue his enemies to complete destruction. Total victory remained elusive. However, each engagement produced various outcomes across different operational theaters, enabling Prussia to persist in the war. Right? This was the ultimate point of it all. When you look, for example, at the Battle of Rossbach in 1757, you see that French attempts to launch offensive operations east of the Saale River for the remainder of the 7 Years' War were effectively thwarted, significantly damaging the reputation of both the monarchy and the French army until the Revolution of 1789. Again, for 30 years, basically, that defeat abated the French resolve to push as east at that, which had already been like an important feat, of course, from the French army that maintained a hell of a military standards and quality, right? We talked about the Grand Querelle, also regarding the doctrinal debates regarding, in that case, the column, the line. But this is interesting because, of course, the same Prussians had toyed with that, like frontal assaults, the bayonet, like largely would prefer the column, but also at large the line remained prevalent in 18th century warfare, and Europeans essentially fought all in the same identical way. So this, if anything, also facilitates the historian's task to highlight certain trends and differences that are minimal but also quite revealing from a system that is otherwise quite balanced, quite leveled. The Battle of Leuthen in 1757, we'll see all these battles, of course, at some point, was notoriously a turning point that ended a series of Austrian victories which had jeopardized Brandenburg's defense, instilling a lasting sense of inferiority also within the imperial high command. So this is arguably the moment in which the Prussians really found their own regional boundaries, regardless of later difficulties, as far as the deterrence, the capacity, the projection of the Prussian army was concerned in the face of its enemies. All right, so it's a very important day, a very important milestone. After the Battle of Torgau in 1760, we see a setback essentially for both sides. Like, there are minor engagements in 1762 which occur when the fighting forces had exceeded their capacity to sustain the war. So as we were saying before, yes, things are still fought for a reason, but fatigue kicks in the systems as well. We will see also like these campaigns, because they're quite important. But let's say the strategic landscape was notably altered. Right? You understand also how important the single battles thus were, right? So that it's not more just like a mechanical, physical fatigue per se. It's just like, okay, why are we doing this, considering that we have already seen that we can at least be beaten, right? And that it would be just a big deal to beat them back rather than thinking in a bigger sense, right? This is exactly, in fact, from the other side what the Prussians were aiming at, right? And you understand here how central moral forces are in warfare, needless to say. Following his defeat at Reichenbach, Daun, for example, permanently withdrew from Silesia, while Prince Henry, this were the Austrians, of course, like deciding essentially that the object of contempt, that Silesia had been fought over because it was not just a rich mineral resource. We talk about it, if anything, for the 16th century, so a bit before. It's not that things had changed that much, but that's essentially, since the War of Austrian Succession, what since the Prussians and the Austrians had fought for. There was also probably the Silesian issue. There are lots of wars actually that superimpose themselves throughout this time. One of Polish succession, etc. They're all intertwined. This was the side of the Austrians. Then Prince Henry, Frederick's brother, another great commander, he was incredibly cold and firm, etc., achieved a victory at Freiberg that at that point irreparably divided the Reichsarmee from Maria Theresia's forces, so compelling the Austrians to evacuate a significant portion of Saxony and placing the Aulic Council in a disadvantaged position at the peace negotiations, which is ultimately, again, what the Clausewitzian paradigm is about, right? War is just a continuation of politics with other means. Here there were very specific goals to be achieved, to be settled, and that also ultimately Prussia did achieve with Austrian loss. So you understand that these were very heavy blows. The 7 Years' War is a very famous one in the history of mankind. More or less everybody knows its events, but how much of all this still passed through some sort of fairly archaic way of war, and still through very specific blows that sort of set the pace and the trend of the rest of the world. This is not just in a military sense, but in a political one, in a cultural one, right? This molded the face of Central Europe in a way that wasn't basically re-altered in a significant sense until World War I. So we have definitely the affirmation of Prussia through these means, and the of course all what happened in between. That's not to say that up to World War I nothing changed. That's not the point. But say the political map of Europe gradually took that form crucially also through the 7 Years' War. And so these are aspects that we can highlight when looking at, how limited armies still were just the generation before Napoleon, right? And so this makes us really reflect on how speedy actually the transformations, the wills, the main changes in warfare can occur, and also how much they owe to the prior motivations and traditions and views, right? So I think I haven't created a video about Prussia. Oh, it's possible. I don't think so. Yeah, still have to. Well, I will, because now we have enough of that. There's Prussian history, Prussian warfare, but also I have Prussian stuff from medieval times, of course. I would like to differentiate a little bit, but we will add to that. I mean, I think Schwerpunkt's future is unavoidably to, of course, to expand, especially modern warfare, because that's a great deal of military history that we tend to not to give for granted, but let's say it's covered in ways that I like to expand a little bit more. There is so much here to cover again that it is really necessary to do so in an orderly fashion. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.